It's recording?
So, ready? A brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be talking about how I see the client, how that view came to be, and how I work with the client from that view. So how I see the client is from a Gestalt theory. That means that I see the client as being whole and in a constant state of change and adjustment due to interconnection. And how I get to know the client is by observing how he or she interacts within the present moment. And this present moment observation tells me and the client about how the client has adjusted to the past history by creating habitual responses. So knowing and understanding these habitual responses tells me and the client where the client may have avoided, denied, or repressed aspects of their personality. And this process in Gestalt theory is called disowning. Disowning is essentially when an individual chooses to not be aware of thoughts and feelings by creating avoidance behavior. So, knowing and understanding these aspects of their personality that they've avoided, denied, or repressed, they begin a process called integration. And integration essentially is when a client begins to know these aspects of their personality that they've avoided, denied, or repressed as being natural to who they are and to the human experience. Integration, in its essence, is self-acceptance. The change that comes from self-acceptance, in my opinion, and Gestalt theory also says, that it's lasting and genuine. The change that comes from self-hatred or self-resentment is often shorter in duration, or if it does last longitudinally, it oftentimes produces more anxiety, more of the problematic behavior that was originally not wanted. Now, awareness is the most important part of this whole process. Now, from what I've seen in my own experience and from what I've read, awareness is the part of the mind that just listens. It knows. It's present. Like right now, you just have an awareness that you're in the room. It's very simple. It's light. You very easily make a whole degree program out of trying to be aware when it's very simple. Mother Teresa has a wonderful way of explaining this in a dialogue with one of her students, where her student comes to her and says, "Mother Teresa, do you speak with God?" And Mother Teresa says, "Yes, of course." And the student says, "Well, what do you say to him?" And Mother Teresa says, "Nothing. I just listen." And the student, looking fairly perplexed, says, "Well, what does he say?" And Mother Teresa says, "He listens also. If you don't understand, I cannot explain." And so, at any given day, our awareness is bombarded with thought. We're a very busy culture. And so when I ask the client to bring their attention back to their body, what I'm essentially doing is I'm pausing this bombardment of thought, and I'm having them make contact with the physical and emotional realm of their existence. When they do this, they're able to see their cognitive distortions, maladaptive strategies, and how they've used these past adjustments to relate to the present moment. Now, when the client projects onto the foreground in Gestalt, this is called the figure formation process. Now, what the client projects onto the foreground largely depends on what the client's motivations and needs motivations and intentions are in the background. Now, we rarely take stock of what the background is, because we're so caught up in the foreground, thinking all problems come from the foreground, all problems must be solved in the foreground. Never mind the underlying needs that we have in the background. And that's where the satiation of the suffering occurs, if we actually make contact with that and get to know what it is, what needs we've been trying to have met, and the distortions that we produce in trying to meet the needs externally. What happens is the mind becomes divided, and like I said, the mind is never actually two, it was always whole. And this division is only an assumption. So one of my meditation teachers pointed out early on in my practice, he says, "Pay attention. When there's two, trouble will brew." And I mean, it's not that funny, but you know, it does give, I'll explain how we become divided and how we become integrated. So say I'm having an argument with somebody who's I have a very personal relationship with, right? And I leave the context of that argument, the physical environment with that person, unresolved. And so I'm in my car and I'm driving home and I'm like, how could he have said that? Like, that was so obnoxious. Like, Jesus, like, I'm not that bad of a guy. And, you know, and on. We carry this inward tension. It's a rub within our mind. And there's a division. And what happens in Gestalt is I essentially say, okay, so it's called the empty chair technique, where you imagine somebody else is sitting in a chair in front of you, and you say, I want you to create a dialogue with this person. And say, okay, so what would you say to this person if you were safe and he or she was sitting right there. And they would start to explain to them their point, and I would say, okay, now I want you to switch and be him or her talking to you. And so what happens if with the counseling is skillful is that there comes an understanding between these two pitted lobes of the mind. And once the understanding occurs, there's forgiveness and there's acceptance, and that's an integration. And explaining it like this doesn't do justice to the actual experience of it. I've done this many times in my own personal life, and it's a very peaceful moment to be integrated. So the boundary, or the body, is always happening here and now. So whatever the client is exhibiting, eye movements, body postures, gestures, tones of voice, I'm going to be asking them to bring their attention to that. And what the body does is, the body is a soundboard for the background. It highlights the background. And the background is necessary for the cessation of suffering to occur, for the dialogue to happen. And I believe a lot of the, the inward resistance that occurs within the mind happens because of internalized messages from the culture at large. And I believe they've done this from a social, emotional, environmental context. I want to be very careful with this, because if an individual is coming to me for therapy and they're living within an oppressive system, I want to be very clear with them that the problem is not inherently within them, and that the problem lies within the social systems that they're connected with. It's very important to understand that, and we can work with some empowerment counseling to reveal that little distortion of the internalized judgment. Because the needs from the background will be met as soon as they realize that the oppression is coming from the social systems, even though it may be complicated for them to grasp that, having lived in a certain way for so long. The techniques that I'm going to be practicing with, I'm going to be using the Gestalt empty chair technique, like I explained earlier, where you dialogue with somebody. However, a little different version, because the population that I counsel is the substance abuse, drug addicted population, and most of them, if I ask them to dialogue with somebody in the chair, the response that I would like to get, excuse my language, would be, I'm not fucking doing that, and then I'd have to go from there. So what I would say is to them is, imagine you were in a very safe place, and your dad couldn't hurt you, and all he could do is listen. What would be the words that you chose to speak to him? And we get the dialogue going like that. I love group counseling. I'm going to continue, and hopefully in my private practice I get the opportunity to do that. There's a technique called making the rounds, and essentially this is when a client would be apprehensive about speaking, we'll say, and they don't really want to participate. And I may ask them, you know, Deborah, would you be willing to do something right now to get yourself more invested and begin building trust and self-confidence? And she'd say, well, yes, of course, because that's a great question. And it sounds like awesome. So I would say, okay, Deborah, so what I want you to do is I want you to just arms by your side like this. This is a very open posture. Just one at a time, go around to each group member and just identify what it is that is holding you back from wanting to speak. And so she'd say, well, you know, I feel like if I speak, you're going to reject me. And of course, we have group rules established, so it's a supportive environment. And what happens is her background is revealed. The distortion that if she holds herself back, that will keep her from rejection, is actually keeping her divided. So the distortion is, it's maladaptive strategy, and so essentially, she gets to see that she can be exposed and not be rejected, and the distortion becomes like that. The Gestalt animation of body movements. Now, traditionally in Gestalt, what they do with this is, Fritz Perls would say, okay, I want you to, you know, somebody's like very expressive, like you get an Italian, you know, and they're speaking with the hands and the paisan, and you know, so the Fritz Perls would say, I want you to animate your body movement and explain to me what your hand's doing right here and the motivation. They're essentially trying to highlight the background. However, I feel like this is a little bit outdated for the population that I serve. So what I would essentially ask them to do is, imagine your hand was a cartoon character. Bear with me, I'm a little weird. And your hand walked in this room and sat down in that chair. What story would your hand tell? Right? It serves the same purpose and gets, I don't know, it's my humor. So, There's another technique called reviewing the past in the here and now. And we have this notion of we have a past history, and we actually miss the reality of how we exist, and it's only the present moment. Memories only occur in the present moment. And we oftentimes lack resolution with these memories because of this distortion. And so we take that story, and I would say to the client that they're repeating a story over and over and over again, I would say, tell that story as if it's actually occurring right now. And so what that does is it brings an awareness, a very, very crisp awareness to the story in the here and now. And what's supposed to happen is that the individual has the opportunity to have closure on the story, because they see it's only a story, and it's the only power it ever had was to be a story of mind or a memory. I'm going to be using cognitive behavioral therapy. With this, I'm essentially just going to be challenging in humorous ways cognitive distortions, paying attention to the client's language, shoulds, oughts, must, always, never, the black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking, fortune telling, and just saying, you know, I'm hearing all these rules and I'm wondering who makes these laws of the universe. Or I'll ask, you know, I'm not getting the connection between this and this when they have two points that, you know, so if I don't do this, then I can never do this. I say, well, I'm not getting the connection. Could you please explain to me the logic? And in their explanation of their logic, they see their illogic. And so kind of have them undistort themselves. Acceptance and commitment therapy, otherwise known as ACT. I love ACT. It's the best. And I've been using this in psychoeducation groups up in Underhill, and I'm going to continue to do it. The clients really love it. Essentially, ACT has many components, but just a few. There's motivational interviewing, solution-focused brief therapy, a little bit of that. I'm not going to go into those because we'd be here all day. But the ACT has a way of explaining how we fuse with thinking, and then we can defuse from thinking by creating distance from it, and how we become psychologically inflexible by living outside of our values. And I heard a wonderful quote that seems to ring true for this, and that is, when our body is in balance, we crave what continues balance. When our body is out of balance, we crave what keeps it out of balance. And so when we've been wronged or harmed, we crave revenge or justice, right? And so that, I mean, just how we become psychologically inflexible is just like that. And how we become psychologically flexible is by living by our values and understanding how we make awareness bigger. There's 3 parts to awareness. The reality gaps that occur, meaning I want what isn't, and the antidote to that being acceptance, and the 3 parts to acceptance. I'm not going to go into that. We could really get ripping on psychoeducation. So Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy, is going to be the foundation for the connection I make with the client. Now, a lot of the cognitive distortion challenges that I'm going to be doing, they can shake the apple cart, and I want to make sure that I have a good rapport with the client, and they know that I'm with them, even though it's going to be difficult during some times. Because the real freedom in these difficult emotions is going into them and through them, and not circumventing them. And I'm going to be doing this by paraphrasing what the client said, summarizing, reflecting back, modeling my affect to the emotional tone of their story. I want to take a little farther than Carl Rogers did. I want to connect dots that the client has not yet articulated and reflect back to them what they haven't yet quite said. And it sounds like this. So, your mother's over here screaming and yelling. Your sister's crying. And your dad's just standing there watching this whole thing. And I'm thinking, from what you told me about your dad, he's your go-to guy. Are you a little pissed that dad's not saying anything and sticking up for you? And he'll say, yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm thinking. And so, I mean, I've done this a bunch of times, so I know the excitement that when they see that I'm actually getting the story very, very thoroughly, I know that I'm in a good place with them, and I'm on the same side as them. And that's when I can say, who makes that law of the universe right now? But you get it. Like, I got to have a good rapport with them. So that's essentially what I'll do with him. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So this is a lot of psychoeducation. There's very refined, detailed ways of explaining how the mind works and how we oftentimes get so lost in thought that the thought dictates everything that, our only options are what the thought is dictating. And if you want to go back to ACT, where we fuse with thinking, we defuse with thinking, it's a similar thing, different language. And I have a very diverse population that I serve, and so I want a diverse language, a diversity of different terms and ways of explaining things. Because if I can't explain to you how to get to Chicago over here, then I've got to tell you how to get there over here. Right? There's also guided meditations, guided imagery, and different ways of explaining their psychic posture. And so this would essentially look like a client walks in and says, like, I'm having the worst day, oh my God. And I would say, so you're having thoughts of having a really bad day. Go on. Right? And so it's a slightly different position. You are the watcher, not the thinking. And so I wouldn't go any farther than just rephrasing what they've said in a new way for them to consider. Although if they're really hyped up, they might not even get what I said, but you guys get it. Emotional freedom technique. Now this is a series of tapping, eye movements, and humming. It's a little gimmicky, but I love it. I'm going to continue to use it. I don't care what you say. When I first did this, I was really, really upset. I don't remember what I do remember what I was upset. I was really upset. Anyways, so I walked in my therapy office, and my therapist was like, I was like, I am raging. And he said, you want to get rid of this right now? I'm like, yeah, okay, good luck, guy. And no one's taking me down from this mountain. And he by the first minute and a half, I was completely over my upset. And after the second round, which is only 3 minutes long, I was laughing so hard we ended the session early. Now, I don't necessarily think that this is an end-all solution to all your problems. However, I have not been that upset about that same situation, which has come up over and over again, since I did this. So I do believe it has long-term healing properties. I got to give a plug to being authentic. I hope you all get this and seen this one, because it is hilarious, and I absolutely love her. So, if I can't model self-acceptance and be myself with my client, they're going to pick up on that. And, even if I am getting anxious and tense, which is going to happen, being able to call that out with the client and say, this is tense, and just calling that energy out and say, so here we are, keep going, because I got to bring myself back down to a position where I'm grounded, keep my body relaxed, come from an authentic place. And no matter how many techniques and gizmos I have and bells and whistles, it's not going to amount to nothing, S-H-I-T, unless I have the ability to be me with that, right? Okay. The environment I'd like to counsel in. Now, ideally, my perfect world, when I'm rich and famous, I would like to have my waiting room smaller than my actual therapeutic room. I believe this is a metaphor for opening up. The mind has the ability to see the environment and have a psychological relationship to it. So if you're walking into an environment that's open, it has like kind of a deep breath feeling, And so, ideally, whoops, I skipped too far ahead. Ooh. Anyways, so I don't want too many distractions in the waiting room. I feel like a lot of the therapy that occurs happens moments before the session, reflecting, self-reflecting, and then moments after. What did we talk about? What did we talk about? I don't want so many distractions in the waiting room, although I don't want it sterile. I want it to feel like home, comfortable. Some interesting literature, maybe bibliotherapies, stuff like that. In my office, I want a lot of plants. I want to make this thing a jungle. I feel like plants are a metaphor for natural growth. And when we plant a seed, our job is to just water it and give it sun. And we oftentimes have a very harsh relationship to natural growth because we have such a aggressive, productive, intention in our culture. And the mind has a natural way of growing and developing. And it's developmental. Change occurs over a long period of time. And we got to just give it water and care for it, and not wish it would grow faster. So anyways, plants, they're wonderful. I would like windows in my office because I believe this is a metaphor for transitions. I want my chair positioned in such a way so that the client is free to go if they're having a really difficult session. I don't want to feel like I'm blocking them. I want some abstract art in my office. I feel like that would give an opportunity for some projection, and we could play with some of that stuff. Let's see. Eggshell colored walls. I feel like the lightness is kind of wakes you up, and it's another breath of fresh air sometimes. So, I built my first house when I was 5 years old. I was paid $2 an hour. No, guys, come on, seriously. So, these pictures aren't representational of how my view came to be, but this is just me when I was around the age when my view started to form. At about 5 years old-ish, I started to notice annoyances in my parents, and I internalized these messages as being a part of me, that I did something wrong. And I also noticed that the adults always wanted to put the kids to bed so early and then hang out. I was like, what are they doing down there? You know, why am I going to bed so early? And I really internalized this. And I was like, there's something wrong with me. And so I would wait outside my door, wait by my door, listening to hear my name. And every now and then I would hear Ethan. Who knows if it was really Ethan? You know, they could have dropped a pan. I was like, that's me. And I would run downstairs, and I would say, I knew you were talking bad about me. What were you saying? And my mom and dad would be like, whoa, 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 Chicken Little. Like, you know, this guy's not following. Like, we didn't say anything. And I was just like, I know they said something. And I would go back upstairs. So anyways, this became a self-fulfilling prophecy over time. And I really internalized, I was very easily rejectable. And very sensitive, very shy. Didn't want to say a word. And I had funny things to say, always. And I was just, my heart would jump out of my chest and thought, man, I would be so rejected if I said something and people didn't like it. So fast forward to when I was early 20s. I got my heart broke real bad. And I fell into a deep depression. And I started using drugs and alcohol. I was arrested several times and mandated to see a counselor who saved my life. And we started doing Gestalt work and practicing mindfulness, which is the reason I believe I gravitated so naturally to this counseling model. He recommended that I go on a meditation retreat. And this is the actual hall that I sat in many times. During this time, I started having these insights, and it's just such a wonderful experience to know that there's a new vantage point from which I can watch life occur, from the seat of awareness, not from the seat of identification. And I was blown away by this characteristic of my spirituality that I never made contact with. And I experienced deep peace like I never really had. It was very important to me. And I couldn't articulate it to anybody. I came home and I was like, wow, guys, check out what I learned. And they're like, yeah, okay. And it was like I was speaking Chinese. And I realized that I really lacked the capacity to articulate in a coherent and concise manner what it is my experience was. And I remember coming off a 1-month meditation retreat. I went right to therapy because those retreats, they call it self-induced schizophrenia, because you're sitting in silence for a month straight and no talking, no eye contact. It's pretty, it'll bug you out. And I came off this retreat, and I always go straight to therapy because I got a lot of garbage to dump after those retreats. And the second I got out of that counseling session, I ran home, I called up Springfield College. And I said, I gotta go back to school. Here I am.